August 17th, 1987. By 7 o'clock that morning, the heat over Greystone County, Texas already looked unnatural. The sky had turned pale white from months without rain. Dry wind pushed dust across abandoned fields where cattle once grazed shoulder to shoulder. Fence posts leaned crooked in cracked earth, and old windmills stood frozen against the horizon like rusted skeletons. Downtown Greystone was crowded long before sunrise. Pickup trucks lined both sides of the county bank building, while tired farmers stood outside, holding coffee cups they barely drank from. Nobody spoke much anymore during the drought. Folks had learned silence after too many bad seasons. They came that morning because another farm was about to disappear. Inside the bank hall, ceiling fans rotated slowly above rows of exhausted ranchers. Men stared at the floor while bank officers shuffled papers like funeral directors preparing burial records. Some families had already lost everything. Others were only waiting for their names to be called. Then the front doors opened. Everybody recognized the sound before they looked up. An old 1964 Ford pickup rattled into the parking lot, coughing smoke through a crooked exhaust pipe. The truck shook violently before dying directly in front of the courthouse steps, with one final metallic cough. A few men laughed quietly. "She's still driving that thing. Lord, that truck belongs in a museum." The driver stepped out slowly. Evelyn Harper, 43 years old, thin from hard years, denim shirt faded by thousands of hours beneath the Texas sun. Dust covered her boots all the way to the knees. She looked tired in the way only farmers look tired. Not sleepy, not weak, just worn down by carrying too much for too long. She reached into the truck bed and lifted a small metal toolbox before walking toward the building without looking at the crowd. Whispers followed her anyway. "That woman's lost her mind. She should have sold months ago. She's farming dirt now." Evelyn heard every word, but she kept walking. Most people in Greystone County believed Evelyn Harper stayed on the farm because she was stubborn. The truth was more complicated than that, and before this story became about droughts, bankers, and humiliation, it was really about land. Old land. Land that remembered things people had forgotten. Inside the building, County Manager Roy Bledsoe adjusted his glasses nervously. Next debt hearing. Evelyn Harper. The room became quiet almost immediately. Everyone knew the Harper farm. 300 acres west of Greystone Creek. Land her family had worked since the 1930s. The same land everyone said was finished now. Evelyn walked forward, carrying only a thin folder and an old leather notebook tucked beneath her arm. At the far side of the room stood Gavin Mercer, tall, clean-shaven, expensive cream-colored suit untouched by dust or sweat. His polished boots looked strange against the worn wooden floorboards, filled with farmers who had spent their lives in mud. Mercer owned Mercer Agricultural Holdings, the company buying dying farms across 3 counties, one desperate signature at a time. Behind him stood 2 young engineers from Dallas, beside a giant drilling map covered with red markings. New wells, pipeline routes, future expansion zones. Mercer believed modern technology could control anything, even drought, especially drought. Roy cleared his throat carefully. "Miss Harper, your outstanding balance is now $93,400. Whispers spread immediately through the room. Everybody knew she could never pay that. Roy continued quietly. "The bank has received an acquisition offer from Mercer Agricultural Holdings for the Harper property." Mercer smiled before standing up. "You know, Evelyn," he said loudly, "most people understand when it's time to let go." A few men chuckled nervously. Mercer slowly walked closer while the room watched. "You've got dead pasture, dry wells, and machinery older than half this county." He shrugged casually. "Truth is, your father should have sold that land 30 years ago." More laughter spread this time. Mercer glanced toward the courthouse window, where Evelyn's old Ford still sat lifeless outside beneath the heat. "Hell," he smirked. "Even your truck knows the farm's finished." The room erupted louder now. Not cruel laughter from happy people. The kind that comes from exhausted men, grateful someone else is being humiliated instead of them. But Evelyn Harper never reacted. Not immediately. She simply placed the old leather notebook onto the table and looked directly at Gavin Mercer. Her voice came low and calm. "You ever spend your whole life standing on land? You don't understand." Mercer smiled confidently. I understand numbers. Evelyn nodded once. That's the problem. The laughter faded almost instantly. For one strange second, the room became completely still. Roy finally broke the silence. The bank is granting 30 days before foreclosure proceedings begin. 30 days. That was all she had left before the Harper farm belonged to Mercer. Evelyn picked up the notebook and walked out without another word. No argument. No tears. No begging. Just silence. But there was something nobody inside that building knew. Something hidden beneath the Harper land long before Gavin Mercer ever arrived in Greystone County. And the deeper Mercer drilled for water later that year, the closer he came to destroying the very thing he was trying to control. Evelyn drove home beneath a sky so bright with heat, it barely looked real. The Harper farm sat 12 miles outside town beyond abandoned grazing fields and dry creek beds, where cracked mud stretched for miles. Wind carried dust through broken fences, while dead grass rolled across the road like smoke. Yet somehow, the Harper property still showed traces of life. Not much, but enough to make people wonder. A thin strip of green pasture remained near the western fence line. A small vegetable garden behind the farmhouse still survived. And beside the equipment, shed stood the machine most of Greystone laughed about whenever Evelyn's name came up. An old diesel water pump built in 1941. Massive iron flywheel, copper pipes darkened with age, handmade welds covering nearly every inch of steel. The machine looked ancient, but it was still running. Slow, steady, alive. Evelyn stepped beside it and rested one hand against the warm metal. Her father used to do the exact same thing. Walter Harper believed engines had personalities. He trusted old steel more than new technology and spent half his life studying water beneath the land, while neighbors mocked him for wasting time. When Evelyn was a little girl, she used to wake before sunrise and find her father sitting beside pipes, driven deep into the earth, listening carefully with an old mechanic's stethoscope pressed against metal. One night she finally asked what he was doing. Walter smiled without lifting his head. "The earth talks," he whispered. Most folks are just too loud to hear it. People called him strange after that. But Walter Harper knew more about water beneath Greystone County than any engineer ever would, especially deep water. After Walter died beneath an overturned tractor during the winter of 1979, everyone expected Evelyn and her husband Daniel to sell the farm. Instead, they stayed. For a while. Life was good. Daniel Harper had broad shoulders and a laugh people heard across entire fields. Together they rebuilt fences, raised cattle, and survived hard seasons year after year. Then came the harvest accident in 1983. One broken combine shaft, one terrible moment, and suddenly Evelyn was alone. No children, no brothers, no money, just debt, dry land, and the old diesel pump Walter Harper spent 40 years rebuilding with his own hands. Most people thought the machine was useless junk. But before he died, Walter once told Evelyn something she never forgot. "This machine doesn't force water," he said quietly one night while repairing the engine beneath lantern light. "It listens before it takes." Back then, she never understood what he meant. Years later, she finally would. That evening, Evelyn sat alone inside the farmhouse kitchen while heat pressed against the windows. Bank notices covered the table beside her father's notebooks, filled with strange measurements, pressure readings, and handwritten warnings. Outside, the diesel pump continued its slow, rhythmic thumping in the darkness. Then headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. 3 trucks. Gavin Mercer had come personally. And what happened next was the part nobody in Greystone County would ever forget. The truck stopped beside the farmhouse just after sunset. Dust drifted slowly through the headlights, while the old diesel pump continued its heavy, rhythmic thumping beside the equipment shed. The sound echoed across the dry fields like a slow heartbeat refusing to die. Evelyn already knew Mercer had not driven 12 miles into dying farm country just to talk. Men like Gavin Mercer only visited land when they believed it already belonged to them. She stepped onto the porch as the truck doors opened. Mercer climbed out first, adjusting his expensive jacket against the warm night wind. Behind him came the 2 engineers from Dallas, carrying clipboards and surveying equipment. Mercer smiled when he looked around the property. The faded barn, the aging fences, the rusted grain silo. To him, It all looked dead already. "You're still watering this place?" one engineer asked while staring toward the pump house. Evelyn did not answer. Mercer walked slowly across the yard, studying the thin strips of green pasture that somehow still survived beneath the drought. That caught his attention immediately, because the rest of Greystone County looked like ash. But the Harper farm still held color. Not much, just enough to make powerful men suspicious. Mercer stopped near the diesel pump and laughed quietly. "That thing still runs." The engine turned slowly beside him, its giant flywheel rotating with deep metallic groans. Thump, hiss, thump, hiss. The younger engineer shook his head. "Impossible." Mercer crouched slightly beside the machine. "You know what your problem is." "Evelyn," he asked, "you're trying to save a century with scrap metal." She leaned against the porch railing calmly. "Number," she said softly. "I'm trying to save land from men who think money makes them smarter than dirt." The engineer smirked. Mercer stood again, patience fading from his face. "I'll make this simple. Sign the property over tonight, and the bank walks away happy." He looked around the dying fields again. "Otherwise, you lose everything in 30 days anyway." Evelyn's eyes drifted toward the western pasture, where dry wind rolled across cracked soil. "My father spent his whole life protecting this land." Mercer scoffed. "Your father buried himself in failure." For the first time, something sharp moved behind Evelyn's eyes, but her voice stayed calm. "You ever wonder why your new wells keep collapsing?" The engineers exchanged quick glances. Mercer's expression tightened slightly. That detail had not become public yet. 3 of Mercer's deep industrial wells had already failed that summer. 2 had collapsed entirely beneath the rock shelf west of Greystone Creek. The company had spent nearly $500,000 drilling deeper every month, while still losing water pressure. Mercer recovered quickly. "Old farmers love stories," he said. "They think dirt has secrets." Evelyn looked toward the pump again. "Some secrets are buried for a reason." The wind shifted across the property, and for a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then Mercer stepped closer. "You really believe that old machine can save this place?" Evelyn remained still. "Number," she answered quietly. "I believe men who drill too hard destroy things they don't understand." That answer stayed with Mercer long after he drove away that night, because deep down, even he knew something about the Harper land made no sense. Every neighboring property had nearly dried out completely. Yet somehow Evelyn Harper still had water. Not much, but enough. And over the next 2 weeks, more people began noticing. First came the rumors. A truck driver passing through Greystone swore he saw green pasture on the Harper property from the highway. Then a feed supplier claimed Evelyn still had enough water to keep cattle alive, while entire ranches nearby were collapsing. At first, people assumed she had hidden tanks somewhere. Then, Mercer's newest industrial well failed completely. The drilling rig struck deep shale beneath the western basin and triggered a cave-in that destroyed nearly 80 feet of steel casing overnight. The story spread through town by morning, and suddenly people started talking about Evelyn Harper differently. Not with respect yet, but curiosity. One afternoon, a group of ranchers drove out to her farm pretending they only wanted to check fence lines nearby. Instead, they stood silently beside the road staring at the Harper property. The old diesel pump continued its slow, steady rhythm. And behind it, grass moved in the wind. Real grass. One rancher finally muttered, "That shouldn't be possible." Another pointed toward the pump house. "My grandfather said Walter Harper built that thing himself after the war." Walter was crazy. Maybe. The older rancher kept staring toward the fields. But crazy men don't usually outlast droughts. And the strangest part was this. The Harper farm was not flourishing. It was surviving. Barely. Which somehow made it even more unsettling. Because it meant Evelyn was not cheating nature. She was working with something nobody else understood. Then came the dust storm. Late September. The worst storm Greystone County had seen in years. Wind screamed across the fields, carrying dirt so thick it turned daylight orange. Trees bent sideways. Barn roofs tore loose. Entire sections of dry topsoil vanished into the sky. Mercer Agricultural Holdings lost 2 storage buildings that afternoon. 3 more wells failed by evening. And when the storm finally passed, the Harper farm was still standing. The next morning, half the county drove out there. They found Evelyn repairing fence wire alone near the western pasture, while the old diesel pump continued running beside the shed exactly as it had before the storm. Mercer arrived less than an hour later with both engineers and a county inspector. This time he was no longer smiling. "You're hiding something," he said immediately. Evelyn kept twisting fence wire calmly. Mercer pointed toward the green pasture behind her. "That water is coming from somewhere." The county inspector stepped toward the pump. "Mind if we take a look?" For a long moment, Evelyn said nothing. Then she nodded once. The engineers opened the side panels carefully, while a crowd gathered around the machine. Farmers removed hats. Dust drifted through sunlight, cutting across old steel and copper, piping blackened with age. One engineer frowned immediately. "These pressure valves." The other leaned closer. "Wait a second." Inside the machine sat dozens of handmade modifications, welded directly into the original engine housing. Thick reinforced pistons, unusual copper chambers, a flywheel nearly twice the normal weight. Nothing about it looked standard. The older engineer suddenly went pale. "I've seen something like this before." Mercer turned sharply. "What are you talking about?" The man swallowed slowly while staring into the machine. "This isn't a farm pump." Silence settled over the crowd. The engineer touched one of the welded chambers carefully. This design came from old military extraction systems during the Korean War. Low-pressure deep recovery systems. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. The engineer looked toward Evelyn. "Who built this?" She answered quietly. "My father." The man stared back at the machine in disbelief. "This thing wasn't designed to pull water fast." He whispered. "It was designed to protect underground pressure." Mercer frowned. "What does that mean?" The engineer looked directly at him. "It means every modern well you drilled," he hesitated. "You drilled them wrong." The crowd became completely silent. Wind moved slowly across the dry pasture, while the old diesel engine continued its deep, steady rhythm beside them. Thump, hiss, thump, hiss. And for the first time since the drought began, people stopped laughing at Evelyn Harper. News traveled through Greystone County faster than rain ever could. Within 3 days, people from neighboring towns were driving past the Harper farm just to see the old diesel machine with their own eyes. Ranchers leaned against fence posts, staring at the slow-moving flywheel like it was something supernatural. But the truth was simpler than magic. Walter Harper had understood something modern companies did not. The land beneath Greystone was old and fragile. Water rested deep beneath layers of shale rock under natural pressure that had taken centuries to stabilize. Modern industrial wells drilled aggressively, pulling too hard and too fast. Walter designed his machine differently. Slow pressure, slow extraction, no shock to the basin. The old man had spent 40 years listening while everyone else rushed, and now the entire county was paying for ignoring him. Mercer Agricultural Holdings tried to contain the damage quietly at first, but disaster moved faster than money. 2 weeks later, state inspectors arrived after reports of collapsed groundwater zones near Mercer's drilling sites. What they discovered beneath the western basin nearly destroyed the company overnight. Several industrial wells had fractured the underground pressure layers exactly where Walter Harper's notebooks warned they would. The deeper Mercer drilled, the worse the collapse became. Suddenly, those old notebooks stopped sounding like the ramblings of an eccentric farmer. They became evidence. Bankers who once shook Mercer's hand stopped returning his calls. Investors began pulling money from expansion projects across the county. Rumors spread that Mercer Agricultural Holdings might file for bankruptcy before winter. And through all of it, Evelyn Harper never said a word publicly. That silence bothered Mercer more than any insult could have. Then came the county water hearing in October. The courthouse overflowed before sunrise. Ranchers filled the halls shoulder to shoulder, while reporters from Dallas crowded beside television crews near the entrance. Nobody came to hear lawyers. They came to watch Gavin Mercer fall. At the front of the room sat Mercer himself, looking exhausted for the first time anyone could remember. His expensive suit hung loosely now. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes. Across the room sat Evelyn Harper, wearing the same faded denim shirt she always wore. No reporters surrounded her. No lawyers advised her. She simply carried Walter Harper's old leather notebook beneath her arm. When the state engineer finally stood to speak, the room became silent. "Our investigation concludes that excessive high-pressure extraction damaged the western groundwater basin," he announced carefully. Evidence suggests Walter Harper identified these risks decades ago. Whispers spread instantly. The engineer continued. Had low-pressure methods been used earlier, much of this drought damage might have been reduced. People slowly turned toward Evelyn, some with shock, some with guilt, and some with the uncomfortable realization that they had spent years laughing at the only family that truly understood the land beneath them. Mercer suddenly stood up. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "One lucky old machine doesn't change reality." But his voice no longer carried confidence, only desperation. Then he pointed directly toward Evelyn. If she understood so much, why didn't she tell anybody? The room went quiet again. Evelyn slowly looked up at him. "My father tried," she said softly. Nobody moved. He spent years warning people not to drill too hard. She paused. But nobody listens to quiet men when loud men are making money. The silence afterward felt heavier than anything spoken all morning. Mercer sat back down without another word. And that was the moment the room turned against him completely. But what happened afterward was the part people remembered most. 3 days later, Mercer drove back to the Harper farm alone. No engineers, no lawyers, no expensive convoy of trucks, just Gavin Mercer standing beside Evelyn's porch, while cold autumn wind moved through the dry pasture. For the first time in years, he looked small. "I need water," he admitted quietly. Evelyn studied him for a long moment. Mercer swallowed hard before continuing. "If winter comes early, half the remaining cattle east of Greystone will die." The old diesel pump continued its slow, steady rhythm nearby. Thump, hiss, thump, hiss. Mercer lowered his eyes. "I'll pay whatever you want." Most people expected revenge after everything Mercer had done. The humiliation, the threats, the laughter inside the bank. But Evelyn Harper surprised everyone, because this story had never truly been about beating Gavin Mercer. It was about something older than pride. She looked toward the western fields, where thin green pasture still moved gently beneath the fading sunlight. Then she spoke quietly. "My father used to say water wasn't meant to belong to anybody." Mercer looked up slowly. Evelyn continued. "Land survives when people respect it, not when they try to own it." And just like that, she agreed to share water access with neighboring ranchers across Greystone County. No contracts, no prices, no revenge. Word spread across the county by nightfall. Farmers who once laughed at Evelyn Harper began arriving at the farm carrying feed sacks, fence posts, spare tools, and seed bags. Men who had mocked Walter Harper years earlier now stood silently beside his grave beneath the pecan tree. Winter finally brought rain in late November. Not much, but enough. Enough for the western grass to return slowly. Enough for cattle to survive. Enough for Greystone County to breathe again. Mercer Agricultural Holdings never fully recovered after the investigation. Gavin Mercer eventually sold most of his remaining land and disappeared from Texas farming circles entirely. Some people said he moved east. Others claimed he entered oil investments overseas. Nobody in Greystone cared enough to find out. But Evelyn Harper stayed exactly where she had always been, every morning before sunrise. She still walked out to the old diesel pump beside the equipment shed. She still rested one hand against the warm steel, while the flywheel turned slowly through the dawn air. And years later, visitors still drove through Greystone asking about the woman who saved the county during the drought. Most expected to find someone proud, someone loud, someone eager to tell the story. Instead, they found Evelyn repairing fences quietly beneath the Texas sun, like nothing extraordinary had ever happened. Because some people do not work for recognition. They work because they love something deeply enough to protect it, even when the whole world laughs at them for trying. And maybe that was the real lesson buried beneath the Harper land all along. People often mistake age for weakness, silence for ignorance, old ways for failure. But the truth is, there are some things money cannot teach. Some things technology cannot replace. And some people understand the world not because they conquered it, but because they spent their whole lives listening to it. By the time Greystone County finally recovered, most folks no longer remembered Gavin Mercer's speeches, his maps, or his expensive drilling machines, but they remembered the sound of that old diesel pump turning slowly through the drought. Still alive, still patient, like the woman who refused to abandon her farm when everyone else believed it was already dead.